We're here to learn more about the closure of the oil refinery, and we're privileged to have 5 speakers representing key players trying to get the government to take action to keep the Marsden Point Oil Refinery in operation. Our next speaker is Craig Harrison. He's the Secretary of the Maritime Union, which represents the seafarers who crewed the 2 coastal tankers that delivered refined fuel from Marsden Point to ports around the country. Welcome, Craig.
Hope you can hear us. Yeah, all good. I won't go much into the refinery because that's not our business. We're seafarers, dockers, but what we do know is a little bit about shipping. So the 2 tankers from R2 and the Korkako, they made about 200 port calls a year around New Zealand, carrying millions of litres of product into the ports all around New Zealand. So we become really involved at the end of last year when we seen when they were dead serious about going to this import model, and we highlighted the stress that's currently in the shipping trades. So to give you an idea, it takes about 70 to 18 days steaming out of Asia to get down to New Zealand. And Zed told us a whole lot of lies in the media when they said they were bringing the crude in the big carriers because they were trying to eliminate the risk coming out of the Middle East. But 3/4 of the crude goes from the Middle East to Asia to get processed into the refinery. So it's coming out of Korea, Singapore, and the refineries are coming down on ships with they call MR class ships. They're a certain size ship because they can't all get into the New Zealand ports. And what they're relying on is the ships coming down, discharging a lot of cargo into Marsden Point or even Tauranga before they can go into like the Timaroos and Nelson. But that all relies on having ships. So we were looking into it, and Zed was really light on telling how it's going to happen. So they're relying on 170 voyages a year coming to New Zealand carrying product. So that's about 28 to 34 ships backwards and forwards to New Zealand. You look at the map, you see where we are, at the bottom, not the top of it. So there's a lot of stress in the market now due to what's going on with Mr. Putin and even with what's starting happening in Asia. So we were arguing that maybe you should rethink the refinery because the supply chain, anyone who's importing products or you're trying to build a house, bringing product is stressed to the limit. Well, it's starting to happen now. We're seeing the tanker market getting swallowed up. There was an LNG tanker heading to, for instance, the other week in Japan. The product was sold again on the market and they made another 3 million and that vessel turned around and it's going back to the UK. So what's going to happen we think in the tanker market is the price is going to go up and up because where New Zealand sits, they come all the way down here, they drop their product, they go back empty, but New Zealanders will be paying for it anyway. But we've got to understand the refinery wasn't producing 100% of our fuel anyway because there's a lot of fuel being imported, for instance, Whangarei, you got Gull, but we should be having at least 90 days of supply in New Zealand. So we hold what they call these foreign tickets, but the product's not held in Australia, it's held in the Northern Hemisphere. So we haven't got a real rethink about that. I can't go into the detail of the refinery, but it's shipping. And I think it'll only be a matter of time that these tankers get swallowed up. They're paying either more money or they just don't see the worth of coming to New Zealand. Thanks.
Thank you, Craig. Our next speaker is Edward Miller. Edward is from First Union, which represents most of the workers, being made redundant by the closure of the refinery and whose skills and knowledge are being lost to the country as many of them head off for jobs overseas. Welcome, Edward.
Can you hear me with that attached there? No?
Alright.
Kia ora koutou, ko Edward Miller, aho. I'm the Researcher and Policy Analyst at First Union, here to discuss the great injustice being done at Marsden Point. It's worthwhile acknowledging that this is not the first injustice being done on that piece of land. This is illegally confiscated land in 1844, and that injustice has never been addressed. That needs to be something that we factor into our long-term thinking. I'm going to highlight two kind of historical scientific facts before going into the discussion, and I think we all know them, but the first one is currently we're at 1.07 out of 1.5 degrees of warming. When we reach that 1.5, it starts, the degree of extreme weather events start to get pretty intense. We need to get out of fossil fuels before too long.
No, we don't.
Go for another discussion elsewhere. The international scientific consensus is clear. The other fact I'm going to raise is that regardless of whether you believe that or not, we are running out of conventional oil. We peaked conventional oil in 2005. The rate of discovery of oil has declined every year since the year 2000.
You're at the wrong meeting. There's no oil around us.
This is shocking stuff, guys.
Please, you can have your say when everyone has had their speech. Please be respectful to everyone else.
Thanks, guys. In light of these two broad trends, workers at Marsden Point for a long time have been discussing having a managed transition to renewable energy. They want to play their part in that process, but they need government to play their part in that process. It requires investments in energy infrastructure, investments in public transport, investments in urban design. This needs to have been going on for years before you switch off a refinery. None of that has taken place. It's worthwhile noting that the big problem for the company, Refining NZ, wasn't the questions around what we've just touched on there, but the fact that from day one, Marsden Point's been 100% union, and as a result of that, they have an extremely strong collective agreement. That means every time collective bargaining comes up, workers actually get the benefit of their rising productivity, rather than that going into the pockets of shareholders. That was a big problem, and that's effectively what's caused this discussion. Craig mentioned that there's more refineries being built in South Asia and Southeast Asia, cheaper labour. Ultimately, the international oil industry has decided that Marsden Point is no longer how they can make their money, so they're transitioning to an import-only model.
Sell it back to us.
We can talk about that later. By early 2020, Naomi James arrived on the scene, refinery closure expert. This kind of timed quite coincidentally with a precipitous drop in refining margins, which Aaron already touched on. The refinery was able to pivot. Instead of producing jet fuel, we started producing diesel to keep the essential service fleet moving. Over that period, under the agreement that exists between the shareholders or the refining customers and Refining NZ itself, you have this thing called a feed floor and cap, which means that when the refining margins drop, the customers have to put money into propping up the refinery. $115 million was paid to the refining company over that period. That works out to roughly a cent a litre in topping up margins, right? Seeing that kind of fluctuation was what the company bounced on. They didn't want to have to top up margins at any point in the future. They saw that as their out from Marsden Point altogether to end refining in this country. So first of all, we saw a major simplification project. They reduced the throughput of the refinery, and they also made it so it could no longer produce bitumen. A year later, we have a 40% increase in bitumen prices. Wonder how these things are connected. In early 2021, we quizzed the Minister of Energy on the impact that this would have on the local community. It's 8% of the region's GDP. It's around about half of manufacturing GDP in the country. In the region. And what we suggested is that there should be some money put aside to be able to support the refinery. We weren't talking about a bailout, and I'll get in a second to what we were talking about, but the minister effectively stopped us immediately and said they don't want another TY point on their hands. Can you guys see any difference in your mind between aluminium security and fuel security?
Same.
Yeah. Because if you can see a difference between those two, then maybe you could be a Minister of Energy or qualified to be a Minister of Energy. In the subsequent months, we wrote to the Minister of Climate Change, and we said that after the 2005 improvements in efficiency, that if you compare the fuel that's refined at Marsden Point versus that we're importing from South Korea, which is our main import destination. It's, depending on which year you look at, it's between 16 and 38% more efficient to refine at Marsden Point than offshore. On top of that, if you're sending fuel that's extracted in the UAE, for example, to South Korea for refining on big ships, big crude ships, and then putting it onto smaller, less efficient refined oil ships and bringing it down, then you have massive transport emissions as well. To our mind, the case for government intervention was actually getting stronger and stronger over time. Not for everyone, though. Our communication was passed back to the Minister of Energy, because the Minister of Climate Change didn't want to talk to us. The Minister of Energy said, okay, come and have a discussion with us. So we went down to Wellington and presented a paper that outlined a series of costs and a series of risks to the government from closing the refinery. The primary risk is the one that probably everyone knows about, right? Fuel security, 1970s, carless days, stagflation, unemployment, racist scapegoating of Pasifika people, all this kind of thing. We actually know the fuel security story pretty well, and we got a good reminder of it in 2017 when Judith Collins busted the pipeline looking for swamp coating. We also put some costs forward, saying there are specific financial costs to government by closing the refinery, in terms of lost tax revenue, both income tax from workers and company tax, that the company will know that Refining NZ won't be paying any longer. And then there's the increased cost of the IEA tickets that Craig was talking about, the storage tokens. And we worked out that over the past 10 years, if you previously closed Marsden Point, then each of those 10 years you'd be looking at somewhere between $33 and $39 million in extra costs that government has to pay or doesn't have in its coffers. Since then, there's other costs that have popped up. There's another $22 million in terms of storage on an annual basis that we'll be paying to Refining NZ. And Whangarei now doesn't have its biggest water consumer, so there's another $3 million in lost revenue. That means that each year we have between $55 and $61 million that's not available for spending on other things from closing the refinery. Putting this in context of the bailout, remember 1 cent a litre, $80 million over a 12-month period, in a horror year of 2020, most years no bailout whatsoever. Our recommendation, underwrite the margins. When the margins fall too low, just like with the current arrangement with the refining customers, then government tops them up. When refining margins go high, then government gets a payout. It all goes into a fund. It's basically revenue neutral. You don't have a cent to pay. Maybe you have a little bit of startup cost, but that gets repaid back over time when the refining margins go high. This is what Australia have done. They chose to prop up margins at 2 refineries. They are significantly more fuel secure than we are as a result of that decision, even though the government has decided that our appropriate storage measure is the same as Australia's. That's a kind of process that's ongoing at the moment. We noticed that when we spoke to the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, that pretty much no work had been done on the whole security question and the refining margins question and any of that kind of stuff. But we were kind of enthused by the fact that after our discussion, they put together a team and commissioned a cabinet paper to look into it. We said, can you publish that cabinet paper before the shareholder vote takes place, so shareholders have an understanding on whether they are going to have smooth margins in the future from government intervention, or they'll be stuck with the existing fluctuating model. The government said, no, we don't want to intervene in the free market. That's not what we do. We're focused on making sure the free markets do their own thing.
When it suits.
In the meantime, we wrote to the 4th biggest shareholder, ACC, and said, do you want to maybe think about safety for the country? We didn't get a response from ACC. During that period, we became increasingly interested in the question of biofuels, being able to repurpose in the long term the refinery to run off biofuels. And I think there's a really good discussion to be had there, and I think Brian's going to talk on that, so I'm not going to touch on that. But I would say that the Climate Commission has recommended a whole range of recommendations around biofuel. MPI has done modelling around the amount of wood waste that we have to be able to produce those biofuels, and the government is introducing a biofuels mandate next year, so we have captured demand for biofuel, which, as Craig points out, we're going to be importing. So another kind of climate impact there. The cabinet paper that was released in December last year that was commissioned And it was pretty interesting to read that because it showed that there was kind of a monopoly on information at play there. Refining NZ were able to influence the discussion on fuel security there. So if you read what it says about the capacity of the refinery to be able to produce fuel with our own Taranaki light crude, they effectively say it's not possible and you need a major rejigging of the refinery. It is possible without a rejigging of the refinery. You do need to have a certain amount of heavy crude there, but it's almost inconceivable that in a closed border event that you would not already have a certain amount of heavy crude there at the time. If you want to run your ambulances, if you want to run your food distribution trucks, if you want to run your essential services fleet, that 5% reserve that keeps the country from collapsing, we can do that with light Taranaki crude with our current refinery without a major re-engineer of the site. And then Craig also pointed out, Aaron, I think both of them pointed out, that in the period since we had this discussion and now, there's been a massive increase in refining margins that's taken place. And the last month that Refining NZ published their refining margins, they were more optimistic than the most optimistic scenario in the shareholder documents, which encouraged shareholders to vote no. So it's much more optimistic. And it's worth noting that in that shareholder document, it actually said that it's more profitable to keep the refinery open than close it. Yeah. Right? Even though they recommended closure, they said it's more profitable the other way, but margins will fluctuate, which is why we recommended the underwriting model. Anyway, what's happened since then? You've had the invasion of Ukraine, and refining margins have gone crazy. I looked on the BP website last night. They report a New Zealand refining margin. They said that it's up to $32 a barrel. Under the current fee floor and cap system, or the one that expired just a month ago, New Zealand, the government, had they entered into that same arrangement, would be making, $23 a barrel as a result of entering into that kind of arrangement. And if that was put aside for fuel security, for underwriting margins in the future, you would never, ever have a problem with margins in the future. The money is there. We keep writing to the government to try and pressure them to take this issue seriously because, as I said, there is a case for fuel security, there is a case for regional economic development, and long term there is a case for the refinery playing a key part in the role of transition to a green energy economy. It's a real shame that workers haven't been listened to by a Labour government here. We will continue to press this, but I was talking about costs at one point, and Aaron's mentioned one. The $300 million cost of remediation over at the refining site. The resource consents say that the company, Channel Infrastructure, now doesn't have to do anything until 30 years from now, 30 years. In 30 years, I wonder if Channel Infrastructure will have any money. Because if Channel Infrastructure at that point goes insolvent, then that $300 million cost falls on us, Council. On us. So it's a really important thing to keep pushing on to make sure that that cost of remediation is pushed on to Channel Infrastructure, and not in 30 years' time, not in 20 years' time, as soon as possible, because this is a crisis that affects all of us, and you're already going to start to feel it next time we get water bills. Let's cut off the costs before they swallow us. Thanks a lot.
If they go broke, they're not going to clean the site up.
Thank you, Edward. Our next speaker will be joining us by video link. We haven't quite got him online just yet, so given that Craig Harrison is not going to be able to stay with us much longer, he has another appointment, we're now going to open the floor to any questions that you might have to address to him. All we ask is that you raise your hand if you do have a question, and Gloria will come round with a mic so you can direct the question to him and keep it succinct.
Yeah, mate.
Yeah, is it true, we've heard reports from operators and prior operators that worked there for 30 years, that they've actually been attempting to close or remove its refining capabilities since 2010 and peaking in 2013.
I'm more on the shipping, mate, not on the refinery, sorry.
That's for you, isn't it?
Yeah.
I love your work, mate.
Sorry, dude. I just make a comment, mate. Like, when we're saying, you know, the government's got to pay the cost or fix everything, it's the taxpayer. I don't know if you know, there's a vessel called Whangarei. They just towed off the Taranaki coast. It was bought by a company called Tamarind a few years ago. And there's a float, they call it flipso. They processed the product, took it away. Well, they went belly up, and it's costing millions and millions to fix it. And they've got to come back at the end of this year, in the summer, and we've got mobs going out there to fix it. So it's the same thing here. And the enemy in this is the fuel companies. For years and years, they come in here and make an absolute killing, as we know. And how many times have we bailed out the BNZ, the Air New Zealand? Well, for some years with a few grey hair like me, I'm getting sick of it. My God, you know, you go to the bank now, half of them are closed. The same thing with refinery, or the, you know, everyone needs to take a breath. Yeah.
I don't really need a microphone. I've got a pretty loud voice. I'm an engineer, and I want to know. We've lost the two coastal tankers that we had. Who's going to cart the fuel?
Give me a shot, mate, all of a sudden. Later. Yeah, go, mate.
How many full-time tankers is required to replace Marsden Point? Fuel tankers, delivery tankers?
Well, they haven't really told us how much. So we're working backwards with the sums. Just we know that there's 170 voyages. So it takes about 3 weeks to get down here. So if you think that you're going to need 3 or 4 tankers on the coast every week, you need about a fleet between 28 to 34 tankers coming here, backwards and forwards all the time. So that's a big fleet. And then when you look at the fleet and you look what's coming, they're flagged out of Mauritius, Liberia, China. And if anyone's had anything to do with shipping, they can tip over at a moment's notice.
I'm an engineer. I want to know, when we lose these 2 tankers that we had here for all the time this thing's been operating, who's going to cart the fuel around New Zealand when you open these tankers out of fuel, because they're only here to drop all the fuel and go again? And the other thing is, how much is going to be stored at Marsden Point available to do that operation of shipping around New Zealand? Because this is the main terminal in New Zealand. All the other ones, on a daily basis, they're emptied out and have to be filled again on a quite a regular basis. Would it be a weekly basis or monthly basis?
So what used to happen is, it worked out about, on average, 1 crude tanker a week would come in, drop a massive amount, and it was refined. So the 2 tankers would cart the refined products around New Zealand. The model now is that you've got about 12 to 13 ships within 7 days sailing in New Zealand. That's how the model's working. So there's at least 9 ships here within a couple of days coming here now. So that's their model. Now if they drop product in Marsden Point, then try and cart it down New Zealand with foreign crew and foreign ships, we're going to go berserk because it's New Zealand jobs. And they have to get the exemption under what they call Section 198 in the Maritime Shipping Act. So, but the point is that you might not get the ships anyway, because as these tankers, what's happening in the Northern Hemisphere, they're starting to charter up all the tankers, fill them up with product, and just anchor them. They're becoming storage. So New Zealand needs a solution for a New Zealand problem, and we should just stop relying on everyone out to sort our stuff out.
My question is to Ed. I put it to
Sorry. I'm going to have to go, mate, in a minute. I've got to go to another meeting down in Auckland and then go to Wellington, so I've got 20 minutes. Do you want any more on the ships? Otherwise, I'll get going.
The thing with it coming in...
Hang on, let it go.
The thing with it coming in...
Sorry, mate. Yeah.
Are there any safety differences between, the old way of importing a big container, a tanker of crude every week, and this, importing the refined products directly?
Oh, yeah, we'd argue like the tankers have been running around New Zealand for over 100 years.
Yeah.
You haven't heard him running aground or crashing. Now, a lot of the tankers, I'll give you an idea. If you go to Dunedin, their oil terminal is just about right in Dunedin. So they've got to go in through Port Chalmers, and they call it the Narrows. You've got to go all the way up the stream. And these ships will be doing it all the time. So the crew, the master, and all, they know it inside and out. You know, and then the crew that work on tankers, it's like the truck drivers with their DG tickets, you know. So they all hold tanker endorsements. They've got advanced firefighting, and they're really regimented in their watch keeping, and they're unbelievably safe, you know, and they're well sought after workers. They're getting swallowed up now, going to Australia. And so my daughter was on one of the tankers. She's in Denmark now because they're after them, and it's going to hard to get them back. And so what you risk with more ships coming down, I use the analogy of the more campers running around with their on your road. So that's the risk, but you know there's still a chance here, and there are chances. We've got to put a pressure on the oil companies, and they should say if you want to make your money in New Zealand, there's a cost to that, and the cost is you've got to use some New Zealanders in your game. You can't just sell us out and put your sit at the pump, make a fortune, knock it off.
Yeah. That's exactly what they want.
The other thing I want to know is how are we going to guarantee the quality coming in with 160 ships?
He'll tell you the quality, mate. I just look after the ships.
Shipping questions, eh?
Yeah, shipping only.
Well, that's shipping.
Yeah, well, I'm a commercial diver by trade. I was actually out on the Whangarei job. And a lot of that was paid for by the taxpayer. On top of that, I'm working right alongside other guys who are coming in from Australia being paid 2 to 3 times what we are. Commercial divers do make good money, by the way, but when we've got foreigners coming in, our taxpayer dollars paying them, taking our money back to their land. What's going on? You know, like that's before we even get onto all the gas side of things. That's just supplying warm bodies to the job. You know, so I mean, New Zealand really needs to start waking up and understanding our money is paying the rest of the world, and we're not getting what we should be getting for our goods.
Yeah, right there, mate. The people I look after, that we look after on the ships and the tenders and stuff, they're on the same screw as the Aussies when the Aussies come down. I was in Aussie the other week talking to a mob that's going to come over and wants to do the wind farms. And they're not going to get it cheaper. We're worth as much money as Aussie. We beat them in rugby. They got all their rugby coaches. Oh, that'll be half decent. Anyway, I'm going to have to go, mate. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Craig.